Paula Cooper. It began with a crime so brutal it shocked not just Indiana, but the entire nation. In 1985, a 16-year-old girl named Paula Cooper broke into the home of 8-year-old Ruth Pelkey, a beloved Bible teacher. What happened inside was an act of violence almost too disturbing to imagine. Pelkey was beaten and stabbed 33 times. Her house was ransacked. Her life ended in the very place she welcomed children to study Scripture. And when Paula Cooper was arrested, the world looked at her not as a child, but as a monster. The court agreed. At just 16 years old, Cooper became the youngest person in America sentenced to death at the time. A teenager condemned to die in the electric chair. It was a sentence that divided the country. For some, it was justice. For others, it was barbaric. But for Paula, it meant entering a world unlike anything she had ever imagined. The world of death row. Prison swallowed her whole. Incarcerated at the Indiana Women's Prison, she was placed in isolation, cut off from the general population, surrounded by the knowledge that her life had an expiration date. Other inmates feared execution, but Cooper was living it, day after day, as a child in a place built for hardened adults. Guards watched her. Inmates whispered about her. She wasn't feared for her violence inside prison. She was feared because she represented something far more haunting, the idea that even children could be put to death. But something remarkable happened behind those walls. Instead of becoming harder, Paula Cooper changed. She studied. She read voraciously. She earned a college degree. She worked to better herself in ways few thought possible. Her growth caught the attention of unlikely voices, including Ruth Pelkey's own grandson, who campaigned for mercy. Even Pope John Paul II intervened, calling her death sentence a violation of basic human rights. In 1989, her sentence was commuted to 60 years. Death row no longer loomed. But prison still defined in her life. Inside the Indiana system, she carried her notoriety like a mark on her skin. Other inmates respected her transformation. Guards watched with interest as she became a symbol of rehabilitation. For Cooper, prison was not just a cage. It was the crucible that reshaped her identity from feared killer to a woman grasping for redemption. After 28 years, Paula Cooper walked free in 2013. But freedom, for someone who spent nearly 3 decades in captivity, wasn't simple. She had lived more of her life behind bars than outside of them. The adjustment was brutal. Just 2 years after her release, she died by suicide, leaving behind questions that have no answers. Paula Cooper's story remains tied to the prison walls that shaped her. She entered as a teenager condemned to die. She emerged as a symbol of second chances, and yet prison's shadow never truly left her. Wanda Jean Allen. The year was 1988, and outside an Oklahoma City police station, a confrontation between 2 lovers turned deadly. Wanda Jean Allen shot and killed her girlfriend, Gloria Jean Leathers, during an argument. It wasn't her first time. Years earlier, she had served time for manslaughter after another violent relationship ended in blood. This time, the consequences would be final. Allen was sentenced to death in 1989. From that moment on, she became a resident of the Oklahoma Women's Death Row, a small, controlled unit where every woman carried the same grim fate. For Wanda Jean, the prison walls weren't just punishment. They were a countdown. Every locked door, every controlled meal, Every daily routine carried the shadow of execution. Unlike some inmates who command fear through violence inside, Wanda Jean's notoriety came from her story. She wasn't the ringleader of a gang or a predator in the yard. She was a woman marked for death, and her case drew eyes from across the country. Attorneys argued she had limited mental capacity, that she didn't fully understand her actions or the consequences. Civil rights groups rallied, saying her execution would be an injustice, but inside prison, those debates didn't matter. To the women around her, she was simply another inmate facing the needle. Prison life for Wanda Jean was suffocating. Death row in Oklahoma was isolation, broken only by short interactions with other women marked by the same fate. She spent long stretches of time alone in her cell, under constant watch, knowing that every appeal denied brought her closer to the execution chamber. Yet she wasn't entirely alone. She formed bonds with chaplains, volunteers, and a handful of fellow inmates. Even within confinement, she sought connection. But notoriety weighed on her. Inmates knew her case. Guards knew her case. Her name was in headlines. She wasn't feared for dominance, she was feared because she embodied inevitability. Watching Wanda, Jean was watching a clock wind down, and when January 2001 came, the countdown reached 0. On the night of her execution, protesters gathered outside the prison gates. Inside, she was strapped to a gurney. Witnesses reported she looked calm. She uttered a prayer. Then the lethal injection began. At 41 years old, Wanda Jean Allen became the first black woman executed in the United States in decades. Her prison life didn't create a reign of terror. It created a tragic symbol. A woman who lived, loved, and killed, who spent more than a decade waiting to die. For those inside with her, Wanda Jean Allen wasn't just another prisoner. She was a reminder of where the justice system could lead and how, for some, prison isn't a life sentence at all. It's a waiting room for death. Kimberly McCarthy. In 1997, the quiet Texas neighborhood of Lancaster became the stage for a crime that seemed ripped from a nightmare. Kimberly McCarthy, a former occupational therapist turned crack addict, knocked on the door of her 1-year-old neighbor, Dorothy Booth. Under the pretense of borrowing sugar, she entered. Minutes later, Booth was dead, stabbed repeatedly, her fingers severed to steal her wedding ring. It was a murder both brutal and senseless, and it sent Kimberly McCarthy to death row. McCarthy's past only deepened the horror. DNA evidence later tied her to the murders of 2 other elderly women. A pattern emerged. Older, vulnerable victims targeted for robbery, their trust exploited, their lives violently cut short. By the time her trial ended, Kimberly McCarthy wasn't just a killer. She was a symbol of predation at its coldest. Prison transformed her into something else entirely. On Texas's women's death row, McCarthy lived in a regimented world of isolation and waiting. Unlike men's units, where death row populations are larger, the women's section was smaller, quieter, but no less suffocating. Every day was the same. Locked in, let out for brief exercise, then locked in again. For years, she lived like this, her reputation preceding her. Inmates whispered about the gruesomeness of her crime. Guards kept her at arm's length. She wasn't a gang leader or a prison shot caller. Her notoriety didn't come from dominance over other inmates. It came from the sheer brutality of her crime and from the fact that she was one of the last women left on death row in Texas, a state that led the nation in executions. She became a name that carried weight not just in prison, but in courtrooms, in clemency debates, and in the media. Her appeals dragged on for over a decade. Twice, she came within days of execution before stays were granted. Inside prison, those reprieves meant more waiting, more isolation, more time with the knowledge that the end was certain, only the date unknown. For Kimberly McCarthy, death row wasn't just punishment, it was purgatory. Finally, in June 2013, the state of Texas set the date and kept it. McCarthy was led from her cell to the chamber in Huntsville, strapped to the gurney, and given the needle. She was the 500th person executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated. More hauntingly, she was the last woman Texas has executed to this day. For other inmates, her departure was a reminder of reality. Appeals run out. For the guards, it was another day's work. For the state, it was history. But for Kimberly McCarthy, prison life had ended exactly as it had promised from the beginning, with death. Stephanie Street Clare imagined Harlem in the 1,920 seconds, a place alive with jazz, poetry, and ambition, but also crawling with corruption, mobsters, and poverty. In the middle of it all stood one woman, wearing a fur coat and diamonds, speaking fluent French, and running her empire with the sharpness of a blade. Her name was Stephanie Street Clare. To the Harlem community, she was a protector. To police and mob bosses, she was a nightmare. And to anyone foolish enough to cross her, she was the most dangerous woman they'd ever meet. Street. Clare didn't inherit her power. She built it, brick by brick, number by number. The numbers racket, an illegal lottery played by Harlem's poorest residents, was her battlefield. While others saw only a game, Street Clare saw opportunity. She turned pennies into millions, creating a business that gave her wealth and influence far beyond what most women, especially black immigrant women, could even dream of in 1,930 seconds America. But success came at a cost. Harlem wasn't empty. The Italian mafia wanted in, and the New York Police Department, rotten with corruption, had no problem siding with whichever gang lined their pockets the most. What set Street Clare apart wasn't just money. It was her voice. She did something unthinkable for the time. She publicly challenged the NYPD. She paid for full-page ads in Harlem newspapers, naming corrupt officers one by one, exposing their extortion and their brutality. Picture it, an immigrant black woman in the 1,930 seconds, calling out the police in print with receipts. For her community, she was a hero. For the police, she was a problem to be eliminated. And then there was Dutch Schultz, a mob boss so ruthless he earned the nickname the Dutchman. He decided Harlem was his for the taking. Schultz thought intimidation would work. But Stephanie Street Clare wasn't intimidated. Their war spilled blood into the streets. Drive-by shootings, beatings, assassinations of allies. It became a battle of wills. Street Clare couldn't be bought, and she refused to bow down. In one infamous confrontation, she pulled out a gun and shot her own husband. He survived, but the story cemented her reputation. Stephanie Street Clare would rather die than be controlled by a man. Still, even the fiercest queen can be toppled. In 1930, she was convicted for possessing policy slips, evidence of her numbers, racket, and later, for assault. Prison was her downfall. Inside those walls, her empire dissolved. The woman who once commanded Harlem like a chessboard was now stripped of her crown, reduced to a number, forced to follow rules she had spent her life breaking. Her incarceration wasn't just punishment, it was erasure. For Street Claire, prison was a cage that clipped the wings of a woman too powerful for her time. Yet, even there, her legend lived on. She wasn't feared inside because of what she did behind bars. She was feared because of what she had already done outside of them. Her reputation followed her like a shadow. Every whisper of her name carried the weight of Harlem's battles, the mob's failures, and the police's shame. Inmates knew her story. Guards knew her story. Stephanie Street. Claire wasn't just another prisoner, she was the woman who had made men with guns and badges tremble. Some remember her for the blood spilled in her wars with Schultz. Others honor her for fighting back against systemic corruption at a time when silence was expected. But all agree on one thing. Stephanie Street Claire was a woman you didn't cross. She left prison eventually, but the empire she built never returned to her hands. Time and circumstance eroded her power. Still, her legend refused to die. Harlem remembers her not only as the Madame Queen of Policy, but as a figure larger than life, a reminder that power isn't always male, and fear isn't always carried in a gun. Sometimes it wears silk gloves and speaks French. Stephanie Street Claire's story ends without the blood-soaked tally of a serial killer, but her shadow remains as chilling as any body count, because power like hers doesn't vanish. It lingers, and it whispers in every story of Harlem's past. There was once a woman who ruled, and even prison couldn't erase her. Roberta Elder. Now imagine another scene. A quiet kitchen in Georgia. Dinner is served. A plate is set down in front of a husband, a child, maybe a neighbor. The smell is familiar. The taste is comforting. But inside that food lies something invisible, something lethal. By the time the meal is over, death has already begun its work. This was the silent terror of Roberta Elder, a woman who turned the act of feeding her loved ones into the act of killing them. Between 1938 and 1952, suspicion followed her like a shadow. At least 3 deaths were confirmed to be her doing. But whispers claim the number could be far higher, possibly a dozen, maybe more. Husbands, children, relatives. Each death ruled a tragedy. Each death earning her insurance payouts, and each one leaving the same haunting question. How many did Roberta Elder truly kill? Her method was chilling in its simplicity. Arsenic. A poison as common as rat killer, tasteless when slipped into food, deadly in small amounts. Unlike knives or guns, arsenic left no immediate mess. Victims grew weak. They suffered stomach pains, dizziness, slow decline. Doctors of the time often wrote it off as illness. In a Jim Crow South where black families were overlooked, their deaths rarely sparked thorough investigation. For Roberta, invisibility was her greatest weapon. The media, too, played its role. White America was fascinated by Nanny Doss, the giggling granny, a white woman who murdered her husbands across the same decades. Doss became infamous, plastered across newspapers. Roberta Elder, meanwhile, was barely mentioned. The white press ignored her, and in doing so, allowed her crimes to vanish into obscurity. Some historians argue that this racial bias shielded her, letting her operate longer, with less scrutiny, than a white killer would have been allowed. But eventually, suspicion caught up with her. Insurance companies began to notice patterns. Too many policies cashed in, too many relatives dead in quick succession. Investigators finally tested the remains of her victims. Arsenic was found. The quiet dinners, the faint smiles, the insurance claims, they all added up. In court, the picture of Roberta Elder transformed from grieving widow and mother to calculated murderer. She never confessed, but the evidence sealed her fate. She was sentenced to life in prison. Behind bars, Roberta Elder became a ghost of herself. No more kitchen, no more poison, just a woman stripped of the very domestic power she once weaponized. Other inmates whispered about her. Some saw her as a monster, the woman who poisoned children at her own table. Others saw her as just another inmate swallowed by a system that barely cared enough to document her crimes. Unlike Stephanie Street, Claire, whose power carried into prison, Elder's reign ended the moment she was caught. She wasn't feared for her influence, she was feared for the coldness of her crimes. While Nanny Doss became a household name, Roberta Elder disappeared into silence. Her victims were largely forgotten, their deaths overshadowed by a press that didn't think a black woman killer was worth front-page news. And yet, the question remains. If 3 victims were confirmed, how many more were there? 11? 15? Did every meal she cooked carry risk? Did every smiling photograph hide a predator? The true scale of her crimes may never be known. Roberta Elder died in prison, unrepentant, her secrets buried with her. No confessions, no clarity, just the lingering dread of what she might have done. Unlike Street Claire, Elder didn't build an empire. She built a body count, one quiet meal at a time. Her story doesn't end with a legacy or with glory. It ends with silence. And sometimes, silence is the most terrifying sound of all. Antoinette Frank. She wore the badge. She carried the gun. And she swore an oath to protect and serve. But in New Orleans, 1994, Antoinette Frank turned the uniform into a disguise, hiding a predator behind the trust of the community. By the time her mask slipped, 3 people were dead, including one of her fellow officers, and prison would become the only place left for her to live out her days. Antoinette Frank was not a seasoned cop. She was young, new to the force, and desperate to be accepted. But beneath her crisp blues and her polite smile, she was drowning in debt, tangled in a secret relationship with a man tied to drug activity, and looking for a way out. That way out came in the form of a Vietnamese-owned restaurant called Kim On's. It was a small family place, the kind of spot where locals came to eat pho and fried shrimp, never knowing that the policewoman who sometimes stopped by wasn't there for security, she was there to plot. On the 4th of March 1995, Frank and her accomplice stormed Kim On's in a robbery attempt. Inside, Officer Ronald Williams, working a side job for extra money, tried to intervene. He was shot and killed. So were 2 of the Vu family, Ha Vu and her sister-in-law, Quang Vu. Their lives ended on the restaurant floor in a hail of bullets, their trust in the officer in blue shattered in the most violent way possible. The community reeled. A cop murdering her own colleague and civilians? It was unthinkable. But evidence piled up quickly. Witnesses saw Frank entering the restaurant. Survivors pointed to her. Ballistics tied her weapon to the scene. She was arrested, tried, and convicted of 3 counts of murder. The badge she once wore became the heaviest symbol of betrayal Louisiana had ever seen. Prison swallowed her whole. Frank was sent to the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, a place already notorious for housing lifers, broken lives, and women cast away from society. For most inmates, being behind bars erases their name. But Frank's case was different. She walked in already infamous, her crime whispered in hallways, repeated in visiting rooms, and etched into the memories of officers who despised her for killing one of their own. Unlike gang leaders who ruled through intimidation, Frank's notoriety was her greatest prison currency. Everyone knew who she was, the cop who turned on her own. She didn't run a prison gang, and she never became the kind of figure who commanded followers. But she didn't need to. Her presence alone made her a figure of unease. Guards watched her closely. Inmates eyed her with suspicion. Some feared her. Others hated her. In a place where trust is already a scarce resource, being a police officer was enough to mark her an outsider. Being a police officer who murdered? That made her radioactive. Life behind bars stripped away her power. There were no uniforms, no weapons, no authority to command. For a woman used to being obeyed, the role reversal was brutal. She was told when to eat, when to sleep, when to move. She went from standing in control at crime scenes to standing in line for chow. And all the while, the shadow of her crime clung to her like shackles. Other inmates carried their own sins, but Frank's betrayal of the badge made her a pariah. Decades later, she remains incarcerated, serving life with no chance of parole, no chance of freedom. For Antoinette Frank, prison became not just punishment, but exile. Every day is a reminder. She once wore the uniform of authority, and now she wears the uniform of the condemned. Joanne Chesimard, Assata Shakur. The shootout lasted only minutes, but its echoes have lasted half a century. On the 2nd of May 1973, on the New Jersey Turnpike, shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, a state trooper lay dead, another wounded, and a young black woman named Joanne Chesimard, better known to the world as Assata Shakur, was in custody. Her life from that moment would be defined by bars, bullets, and eventually, escape. Assata wasn't just any suspect. She was a member of the Black Liberation Army, a militant offshoot of the Black Panther Party. To law enforcement, she was a terrorist. To her supporters, she was a soldier in a war against oppression. On that night in 1973, her life changed forever. Police accused her of firing the fatal shots that killed State Trooper Werner Forster. She was arrested, tried, and ultimately convicted of murder. Her sentence, life in prison. Prison, however, was never just prison for Assata. From the moment she arrived, she became a political prisoner in the eyes of her followers. Behind bars, she didn't command gangs or run contraband. What she wielded was influence. Letters poured in, supporters marched. Writers, activists, and students rallied to her cause. To the state, she was a dangerous murderer. To the movement, she was a living martyr. Her time behind bars was marked by strict control. Authorities feared escape attempts, feared riots sparked by her presence. She was often isolated, cut off from others. But isolation only strengthened her aura. Inmates whispered about her. Some admired her defiance. Others kept their distance. Unlike most prisoners, who are broken by the system, Asata seemed to grow more powerful in spirit the longer she stayed. Then came the unthinkable. In 1979, with the help of fellow activists, Assata Shakur escaped from prison. Guards were overpowered, weapons were smuggled in, and she vanished. For the United States government, it was a humiliation. For her supporters, it was liberation. She fled underground, moving through safe houses, eventually surfacing in Cuba, where she was granted asylum. From a cell in New Jersey to the streets of Havana, she transformed from prisoner to fugitive, her story mythologized with every passing year. Inside prison, her reputation had already set her apart. After her escape, her absence only magnified the legend. For inmates left behind, her story became proof that escape was possible, that resistance could outlast the system. For law enforcement, her name became a symbol of unfinished justice. She was labeled a terrorist, placed on the FBI's most wanted list, and marked as one of the most dangerous fugitives in the world. Today, Assata Shakur lives in exile, but her prison years remain central to her story. She endured confinement, isolation, and the crushing weight of a murder conviction. But unlike so many who enter prison and disappear into silence, she left with her identity sharpened into legend. In the prison yard, she was not just another inmate, she was Assata, a name that could rally movements, spark debates, and divide a nation. Her escape cemented her place in history. Some call her a murderer who fled justice. Others call her a hero who outsmarted an unjust system. But in those years behind bars, before the escape, she lived in a liminal space, both captive and unbroken, both prisoner and symbol. And that is what makes her story terrifying, not in the sense of random violence, but in the sense of power. Because sometimes the most feared prisoner isn't the one who controls the cell block with muscle. Sometimes it's the one who controls the story inside the walls and far beyond them. Hannah Mary Tabbs. In February of 1887, Philadelphia police were summoned to a pond near the Schuylkill River. The water was icy, the air sharp, and yet something far more chilling lay half hidden in the mud. A torso headless, armless, legless, its flesh hacked away, its features erased. A human body stripped down to nothing but horror. The newspapers called it the torso murder, and before long, suspicion turned toward one woman, Hannah Mary Tabbs. Tabbs was not an unknown figure in Philadelphia. She was a black woman in her 40s, fierce, outspoken, and by reputation, violent. Neighbors whispered that she was quick to anger, quicker to strike, and that her presence alone could silence a room. In an era where women, especially black women, were expected to be submissive, Hannah Mary Tabbs was anything but. She carried herself like a storm. The torso was eventually identified as belonging to a young black woman named Wakefield Gaines. Witnesses tied Tabbs to the victim, and police began to uncover a twisted story of jealousy, rage, and an act of violence that went far beyond a simple killing. Tabbs denied committing the murder herself, instead shifting blame to a young male accomplice. But she admitted, chillingly, that she had helped dispose of the remains. For prosecutors, it was enough. Her trial gripped the city. In the packed courtroom, reporters described her as cold, defiant, unshaken, even as the dismembered torso was brought into evidence. Unlike the young man on trial beside her, who broke down and wept, Tabbs remained stone-faced. The jury convicted her not of murder, but of being an accessory to the crime and of assault. Even so, the press christened her with a title that would cling to her name forever: the Torso Murderess. Prison became her new stage. In the late 19th century, incarceration for women in Pennsylvania was brutal. Cells were small, damp, and infested. Food was meager, work was punishing, and medical care was almost non-existent. But Tabbs endured. Just as in her community, her reputation followed her behind bars. She was not a woman who could be ignored. For other inmates, she was a paradox. Some feared her, whispering about the torso, about the dismembered body parts dredged from the pond. Others were drawn to her strength, seeing in her defiance a model of survival in a world stacked against them. She was known to lash out physically, fighting, threatening, asserting dominance in ways that unsettled guards and prisoners alike. Her violence, the very trait that had landed her behind bars, became her armor in confinement. Unlike men who ran prison gangs or built networks of influence, Tabbs did not organize others. She didn't need to. Her reputation was enough. In a women's prison where most inmates carried the shame of theft or sex work, Tabbs carried the aura of something darker. To them, she was a killer who had touched the unthinkable, the severing of flesh, the scattering of human remains. Her crime was not just violent, it was grotesque. That grotesqueness elevated her, making her name linger in hallways and whispers for years. Even newspapers couldn't stop talking about her, writing lurid details about her every court appearance, her temper, her outbursts. Inside prison, she was infamous, but outside she was a cautionary tale, a black woman painted as the embodiment of savagery in a time when racism and sensationalism colored every headline. Yet behind the sensationalism was something very real. A woman who had committed a crime so grisly it defied comprehension, and who now bore the weight of that reputation in every cell she occupied. Hannah Mary Tabbs eventually faded from the record, her final years lost to time. But the prison system of the 19th century remembered her. Guards noted her defiance. Inmates remembered her temper, and historians still recall her as one of the most notorious women in Philadelphia's criminal history. She entered prison branded the Torso Murderess, and she left with that name etched permanently into her legacy. For those who shared a cell block with her, prison life meant living in the shadow of a woman who had touched horrors most could never imagine. Patricia Blackmon. On the 29th of May, 1999, in the small Alabama town of Dothan, police were called to a modest home. Inside, they found the body of 2-year-old Dominiqua Blackmon. The toddler's injuries were catastrophic. She had been beaten, bitten, struck with blunt objects. Her tiny body was covered in bruises, contusions, and broken bones. Some injuries were fresh. Others showed signs of repeated abuse. At the center of it all stood her adoptive mother, Patricia Blackmon. The brutality of the crime stunned even veteran investigators. In the courtroom, photographs of the child's body silenced jurors. Prosecutors described a beating so savage it seemed to come not from a mother, but from a monster. Blackmon was convicted of capital murder, and in a decision that sent shockwaves through Alabama, the jury recommended the death penalty. When Patricia Blackmon entered prison, she entered not just as another murderer, but as one of the most despised figures imaginable, a mother who killed her child. Inside the walls of Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, that crime carried its own special stigma. Inmates who themselves had committed violence drew a line at crimes against children, and Patricia crossed it in the worst possible way. Her prison life was marked from the beginning by isolation and notoriety. Guards knew her case. Inmates knew her case. Everyone knew the story of the little girl beaten to death. For many behind bars, Blackman was not just another convict. She was the embodiment of betrayal, the ultimate violation of maternal trust. In a women's prison, where motherhood is often the last tether to dignity, Patricia Blackman was the woman who destroyed that sacred bond. She was placed on death row, a small and suffocating unit where days blur into one another, meals through a slot, recreation in cages, endless hours in a cell, alone with the knowledge of what she had done. Other death row inmates could talk about robberies gone wrong, violent lovers, moments of rage. Patricia's crime stood apart. Even among killers, she was despised. There were no gangs at her command, no followers seeking her protection. Unlike figures who gained notoriety by ruling cell blocks, Blackman's reputation was built only on revulsion. Inmates avoided her. Guards kept their distance except when necessary. Conversations about her name ended in silence or disgust. In prison culture, there are crimes even criminals cannot stomach, and child murder is chief among them. Patricia Blackman carried that brand every day. Over the years, her case became part of broader debates about the death penalty in Alabama. Attorneys argued over the fairness of her trial, over whether her sentence was excessive. But inside the prison, those debates meant little. For the women locked beside her, all that mattered was the crime. A toddler beaten beyond recognition by the very person sworn to protect her. Life on Alabama's death row is a slow grind of waiting for appeals, waiting for hearings, waiting for the day when waiting ends. For Patricia, each denial only deepened the weight of confinement. Her world was a few square feet of concrete, the steady gaze of correctional officers, and the whispers of inmates who could not forget what she had done. Unlike other notorious killers whose prison years are filled with interviews or leadership, Patricia's time inside has been marked mostly by silence. She is remembered not for what she did behind bars, but for what she did before them, and that silence only deepens the unease of her presence. Patricia Blackman remains a haunting figure in Alabama's prison history, not for influence, not for rebellion, but for the nature of her crime and the way it shaped her life in confinement. In prison, reputation is everything, and hers is a reputation that ensures she will never be anything more than the woman who murdered her child. For her fellow inmates, that is enough to make her one of the most feared, despised, and isolated women they have ever known. Linda Carty. It was May 2001, Houston, Texas. A young mother named Joanna Rodriguez was found dead in the trunk of a car, her body wrapped in duct tape, suffocated, her infant child missing. The baby was recovered alive, but the crime, the abduction, the cruelty, the unimaginable plan to steal a mother's baby by killing her would shock Texas and bring international attention to one woman, Linda Anita Carty. Carty was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. Born in St. Kitts and a citizen of the United Kingdom, she had once worked as a school teacher and even claimed to have been an informant for the Drug Enforcement Administration. But by 2001, her life had spiraled. She was in debt, estranged from her husband, and desperate. Prosecutors said her desperation took a horrifying form, plotting to abduct a newborn child and raise it as her own. The evidence was damning. Rodriguez had just given birth. Carty, accompanied by accomplices, forced their way into her apartment, tied her up, and abducted her. Hours later, Rodriguez was dead, suffocated by duct tape. Her infant son was found alive in another car. The brutality of the crime, the targeting of a mother, the sheer coldness of the plan shocked even seasoned officers. The trial moved swiftly. Witnesses, accomplices, and forensic evidence painted a picture of Carty as the mastermind. In 2002, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. And from that moment on, Linda Carty entered one of the most infamous institutions in America, Texas's women's death row. Prison life on death row is unlike any other. The Mountain View Unit, where Texas holds its condemned women, is a world of routine and suffocation. Inmates spend most of their days in solitary cells, allowed out only for showers or brief recreation. The silence is heavy, broken only by the echo of doors and the shuffle of guards' boots. For Linda Carty, this silence became her life. But unlike many death row prisoners who fade into obscurity, Carty's case exploded into international controversy. As a British citizen, her trial drew scrutiny from across the Atlantic. The British government intervened, questioning whether her legal representation was adequate. Human rights organizations took up her case, arguing that she was denied a fair trial. Suddenly, this Caribbean-born, Texas-condemned woman was not just another inmate, she was a global cause. Inside the prison, that notoriety made her different. Inmates whispered about her. Guards watched her closely. Unlike prison shot callers or violent instigators, Linda Carty's influence came not from dominance inside the yard, but from the outside world pressing against the walls. Newspapers, documentaries, and even members of Parliament invoked her name. And for the women locked beside her, that made her both strange and untouchable. But the prison itself was unrelenting. For years, she has lived in a small cell, surrounded by other condemned women, all of them waiting for a date with the executioner. Death row is designed to strip away identity, and yet, Carty's has endured. Her fellow inmates see her as someone who lives under constant spotlight, her story debated in places far from the concrete of Gatesville, Texas. Some sympathize. Others loathe her for the crime, suffocating a young mother to steal her child. Prison records describe her as compliant, not a troublemaker. She isn't the woman leading fights or controlling contraband. Instead, she is a figure of whispers, her crime so shocking, her defense so contested, that her very presence seems to hang heavier than most. In the end, Linda Carty's prison years are defined not by the gangs she ran or the fear she commanded, but by the chilling nature of her crime and the extraordinary spotlight it attracted. Among the women of Texas death row, she is remembered as the one whose case traveled far beyond the prison walls, yet whose fate remains sealed within them. For the guards, she is another condemned prisoner. For her fellow inmates, she is the baby snatcher, a name that ensures her place in the dark memory of Texas prisons forever. Carlette Elizabeth Parker. On a winter night in 1998, in a quiet North Carolina town, 6-year-old Alice Covington disappeared. She was elderly, frail, and alone when two people broke into her home. Among them was a woman named Carlette Elizabeth Parker. What happened next would shock the community. Alice was kidnapped, driven away from her house, and later murdered. Her body was discovered, Her life ended not in the peace of her home, but in terror, abandoned and discarded. For investigators, the case quickly pointed to Parker and her accomplice. The evidence was clear. They had targeted Covington for money, abducted her, and left her to die. In 1999, Parker was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Her crime, the abduction and killing of a defenseless elderly woman, was described as one of the cruelest in state history. Prison became her new reality. Parker entered North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, the state's only women's prison and the place where female death row inmates are held. Like Texas's death row, North Carolina's unit is small, suffocating, and defined by isolation. Few women are sentenced to death, which means each one is known, discussed, and remembered by both staff and fellow prisoners. Parker was no exception. Her crime carried a stigma. Inside prison culture, crimes against the elderly, like crimes against children, are often seen as cowardly, despised even by hardened inmates. Many prisoners justify their own violence as crimes of passion, self-defense, or desperation. But Parker's crime was seen as predation. She and her accomplice targeted a woman who could not fight back, who should have been untouchable. Among her peers, that reputation followed her everywhere. Her life on death row was marked by silence and waiting. Inmates there spend 23 hours a day locked in their cells, allowed out only in small groups for yard time or brief recreation. For Parker, each day was a mirror of the one before, steel doors clanging shut, guards watching every move, the endless knowledge that one day the waiting would end in execution. Unlike others who gained influence by running schemes or commanding fear, Parker never became a leader in prison. She did not control contraband or build alliances. Instead, she lived in the shadow of her crime. Other inmates remembered her not for who she was inside, but for what she had done outside, abducting an elderly woman and leaving her to die. It was a stain that marked every interaction. Guards described her as quiet, even compliant. But compliance did not erase the whispers. Within the cell blocks, her name was always tied to Covington's. For some inmates, Parker was a warning proof that targeting the weak carried not just a death sentence in court, but a permanent stigma in prison hierarchy. For others, she was simply a figure to avoid, a woman whose crime was too grotesque to overlook. Life on death row is not filled with dramatic outbursts or bloody fights. It is slow suffocation. And for Parker, that suffocation was worsened by the way her fellow inmates saw her. She was not feared in the sense of violence inside prison. She was feared in the sense of revulsion, a reminder that cruelty knows no boundaries, not even age. Over the years, Parker's case appeared in death penalty reports and human rights debates. But inside prison, those conversations faded into the background. What remained was her daily life, steel bars, cold routines, and the endless echo of her crime. She was not remembered as a mastermind, nor as a manipulator of the prison system. She was remembered simply as the woman who killed Alice Covington, a crime so cruel that even among the condemned, it marked her forever. Carlette Elizabeth Parker's years behind bars show how prison does not just punish, it brands. For her, the brand was unavoidable. The kidnapper and killer of an elderly woman. It shaped her interactions, her reputation, and her fate. In North Carolina's women's prison, she was never just another inmate. She was the embodiment of cruelty against the defenseless, and in the silence of death row, that reputation followed her until the very end. Celeste Simone Carrington. In the early 1990 seconds, East Palo Alto was already reeling. It had been branded the murder capital of America, a community suffocating under violence, drugs, and despair. But in 1992, a new kind of fear emerged, quiet, sudden, and shocking. It wasn't a gang shootout or a street dispute. It was the murders committed by a janitor. Her name was Celeste Simone Carrington. Carrington's crimes didn't fit the usual mold. She wasn't hunting strangers in alleys or victims in the night. She was killing in places where people felt safe workplaces. Property managers, co-workers, people who trusted her presence. Victims included Caroline Gleason, a respected Palo Alto property manager, and Victor Esparza, a fellow janitor in San Carlos. The murders were cold, calculated, and tied to robberies. Carrington herself would later confess, her words chilling in their bluntness. By the time investigators pieced her crimes together, the Bay Area was stunned. A janitor, someone employed to clean and maintain buildings, had turned them into killing grounds. Her arrest, trial, and ultimate conviction brought the death penalty a rare sentence for women in California. And in 1995, she entered one of the most feared addresses in the state, Central California Women's Facility, home to the women's death row. Prison life for Carrington was a stark contrast to her years of quiet employment. Death row in California is not chaos, it is monotony. A row of women locked in their cells nearly 23 hours a day, their names known only to guards, lawyers, and the occasional journalist. But even among the condemned, Carrington's case made her stand out. The janitor who killed her co-workers, the woman who turned ordinary workplaces into scenes of execution. Inmates whispered about her. Some avoided her. Others, fascinated, tried to befriend her. But Carrington's presence carried a weight. Unlike many women behind bars whose crimes were crimes of passion or desperation, hers felt clinical, detached, deliberate. That difference marked her. Guards described her as cold, sometimes volatile, always carrying the shadow of unpredictability. Prison reports suggest she was dangerous even inside. Not a shot caller, not the head of a gang, but someone capable of sudden violence. The kind of inmate whose silence was unsettling, whose outbursts left scars. In a system where survival often means finding allies, Carrington lived in the uneasy middle ground, feared but not followed. For guards, she was a constant risk. For other inmates, she was a reminder that danger isn't always loud. It can come quietly, from the woman sweeping the floor beside you. Her notoriety became part of her prison identity. She wasn't just another woman waiting on appeals. She was the janitor who confessed to killing, the one newspapers had splashed across headlines, the one who made workplaces unsafe. Death row is a slow grind in California. Decades of appeals, endless legal wrangling, and the reality that executions are rare. For Carrington, that means her sentence is less about the needle and more about waiting in a place that defines her by the worst moments of her life. Behind bars, she is not Celeste, the janitor. She is Celeste Carrington, inmate number on death row, a woman remembered not for what she does in prison, but for the way her crimes shattered trust outside it. And yet, Her reputation inside ensures that even among other killers, she stands apart, notorious, dangerous, unpredictable, a reminder that sometimes the quietest faces hide the darkest violence. Erica Yvonne Shepherd. The crime was brutal. In June 1993, in Houston, Texas, 3-year-old Marilyn Meagher was found dead in her home. She had been bludgeoned and stabbed during a robbery, the violence shocking even seasoned investigators. 2 suspects were tied to the scene, one of them an 8-year-old named Erica Yvonne Shepherd. Shepherd was arrested, tried, and convicted of capital murder in 1995. Prosecutors painted her as an eager participant in the robbery and killing. The jury agreed. She was sentenced to death, joining the small handful of women condemned in Texas. From that moment forward, her life became defined not by the streets of Houston, but by the steel and concrete of Gatesville's Mountain View unit home to Texas's female death row. Life inside was suffocating. The women on death row lived in near-total isolation. Small cells, meals alone, recreation in cages, a life measured in hours locked down, with little to break the monotony beyond legal visits and the occasional interaction with other condemned inmates. For Erica, who was barely out of her teens, it was a descent into a world where time stood still. But unlike some notorious death row figures, Shepherd never commanded fear through violence inside. She wasn't known for fights or gang ties. Instead, her notoriety came from something else, the brutal nature of the crime and the questions surrounding her role in it. Defense attorneys later argued she had been shaped by a childhood of trauma, poverty, and abuse. They pointed to claims of cognitive impairment, to her vulnerability at the time of the crime, to her status as a teenager swept into something far bigger than herself. Inside prison, however, explanations didn't matter. What mattered was reputation, and Shepherd's reputation was sealed by her crime. Other inmates saw her as the teenager who murdered for money, the girl who turned into a killer before adulthood. Even as lawyers fought on her behalf, prison culture branded her permanently. Her years inside have been marked by long stretches of silence. Unlike figures such as Linda Carty, who attracted international campaigns, Shepherd's case drew only occasional attention in human rights circles. That lack of spotlight shaped her prison experience. While others lived under constant scrutiny, Erica Yvonne Shepherd lived in a kind of forgotten limbo, her name known to a few, her existence defined by endless waiting. Still, her presence in prison carried its own unease. To guards, she was young when she entered, but hardened by the years of confinement. To other inmates, she was a reminder of how quickly life could spiral from desperation to a death sentence. Shepherd didn't lead, she didn't dominate, but she didn't need to. Her very name carried the weight of a crime so brutal it ensured she would never be seen as ordinary. On Texas's women's death row, she became part of a strange sisterhood, women condemned, isolated, and waiting. Their crimes were different, their stories unique, but their futures bound by the same inevitability. For Shepherd, that meant living each day under the shadow of her conviction, her youth long gone, her reputation frozen at the moment of Marilyn Meagher's death. Her story inside prison is not one of rebellion or notoriety in the traditional sense. It is one of erasure, of being locked away, branded forever, and remembered only as a teenage killer whose life ended before it had fully begun. She may not run gangs. She may not strike fear with violence behind bars. but she remains feared in another way. As the woman whose name still echoes in the legal files, whose crime still haunts Texas's history, and whose presence on death row ensures she will always be remembered, even if only as a whisper in the halls of Mountain View.